Thank you, Randy, and thank you, ASPO-USA, for inviting me back to speak in Houston. It's a pleasure to be back here. I did live here for a while, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, and it really is good to be back in Texas and in Houston. The title of my talk, I didn't actually draw up myself. It was imposed on me by Steve Andrews, so I take neither credit nor blame for it. But I am going to talk about data and the lack of it, because I think that's one of the big problems that reservoir engineers have, and it's also a problem, of course, that ASPO has. Another problem ASPO has, though, I think, and that perhaps has helped determine what I'm going to talk about today, is a lack of clarity on terminology. When we talk about something, the people we're talking to don't always understand what we're saying. Part of this, I think, stems from the fact that most people in ASPO are what I would call amateurs. And when I said this on the oil drum a few months ago, I was castigated for being rude and unappreciative of the many people who do such a lot of good work analyzing this sparse data that's available. To me, an amateur is someone who does something because he loves doing it and isn't getting paid for it. And it's not a derogatory term at all. But some people were upset by what I said. I apologize to them. I certainly didn't mean to be rude. It's interesting, though, because I think part of the problem on a word like that probably arises from British English or European English and American English, and there are many examples of words and phrases that mean different things on different sides of the Atlantic. I think Winston Churchill had a phrase. He talked about the Americans and the British people, of which I'm not one, but he talked about the Americans and the British having what was it? They were united by a common history, but they were separated by a common language. And I think that sort of situation applies to some extent when people from the industry who were or are professionals talk to people who deeply care about what the industry is doing but aren't professionals themselves. And just a final comment before I get going. I'm always amused when I get on to my continental flight from Ireland to fly to Newark, when the flight attendants tell me that the flight is going to take off momentarily. Most Europeans would prefer that it took off for a lot longer than that. And even worse, when it approaches Newark, we're told that it's going to land momentarily. So there's a sort of vision of people standing up at the door about to leap out before it takes off again. So today I'm going to talk about reserves growth, what it is and what it isn't, and why perhaps misunderstanding of many people, not just in the peak oil movement, but people outside the reservoir engineering movement, misinterpret what reservoir engineers mean about reserves growth, and how this can lead to a tremendous amount of confusion when it comes to looking at future oil supply. Let's just think where we are with preaching our peak oil message. When we assembled for the ASPO Europe meeting in Cork in Southern Ireland a few weeks ago, we heard Lord Oxborough, the ex-Shell UK chairman, and we heard Mr. Schlesinger, Secretary Schlesinger, tell us that, as far as they could see it, that there now is a wide acceptance that there is going to be a gap in the future between oil supply and oil demand. I mean, that's something, an acceptance that wasn't there 5, 6 years ago. There's uncertainty about the timing of this supply peak, and we've heard that again this morning. And we've been hearing from Bob Hirsch for quite some years now that if this peak is going to be within the next 10 or 15 years, then it's probably already too late to take the financial and technical steps required for us to be able to make a smooth transition to this situation where oil supply doesn't meet demand. And on the basis of those things, I mean, as far as ASPO is concerned, my belief is that we should be concentrating much more now on the shape of the supply curve after the peak is reached, rather than worrying quite so much about exactly when it's going to be reached. An aside, unless supply reaches a very sudden peak, we need to be aware that problems for us all are going to come not when supply has peaked, but when supply isn't increasing rapidly enough to meet demand. So let's not lull ourselves into thinking, having listened to Chris Grabowski, that it's going to be 5-6 years before a peak comes, so at least we have that long before we see a problem. I think if he's indeed right about his indication of when a peak might occur, then our problems are going to come significantly before that. When we sit down to try and predict what the supply curve will look like in the future, we have two groups of fields that we need to think about. The ones which are on production, and we need to understand how they're going to perform. People have been talking already today about decline rate. We need to be able to understand when they're going to go into decline and then how they'll behave subsequently. And then, again, following on from Chris Grabowski's talk, we need to understand what new projects are around, what new prospects are around for our explorers, and how development of those fields may occur. Both Bob and Chris, I think, talked about decline rates from existing fields, and there's been a lot of work, a lot of papers published over the last few years which have talked about decline rates in existing fields. People seem to be relatively comfortable that they understand what worldwide decline rates are going to look like. But as we'll see in a moment, there's a wide range of opinions on what new discoveries may be and how new technology might change our opinion of how existing fields are going to behave in the future. The estimates that are around for future discoveries show a huge range. We've got the figures that Colin Campbell came up with, which I think are sort of accepted as the ASPO yet to find number of about 130 billion barrels. We've got the USGS study from their 1995 work, which shows over 700 billion barrels. So a factor of what? A factor of 6 there almost between Colin Campbell's numbers and the USGS mean level. That wasn't even their most optimistic one. We all know, I think, that actual discovery rates suggest that the USGS estimates seem to be on the optimistic side. In fact, it seems even as though the low range on the USGS side is looking as though it's going to be hard to achieve. But things, I guess, could change. So on the yet to find side, there's a big range of numbers. But if we're talking about what's going to happen over the next 5-10 years in terms of when a peak might occur and what might happen immediately afterwards, the yet to finds really don't make a lot of difference. When are we going to find this stuff? We're not going to find it all in the next couple of years. And we've heard, again from Chris, that the average time to develop significant new discoveries is something like 6 to 7 years. So if we're not going to find it for 10 years, we'll sit around looking at it for a while and then make development decisions. This yet to find oil is not really going to have any influence on our medium-term supply. Most of the production will come long after we've hit a peak. So it's fairly easy to see, I think, that if we're talking about supply over the next, let's say, 10 to 15 years, that the only way in which supply levels are going to be maintained in the face of declines from existing fields, and perhaps increase slightly, is if what's called reserves growth can be achieved quickly and is substantial. So that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time, reserves growth and what it means from a reservoir engineering point of view. The trouble is that when we come to talk and think about reserves growth, we find that there is absolutely zero agreement between the optimists, the pessimists, the geologists, the engineers, the Europeans, the Americans. Any sort of person, any person you take from one group and take his reserves growth estimate, compare it with somebody else's from a different group, the numbers are just in totally different ballparks. Colin Campbell's work, which again is the basis for the sort of accepted ASPO forecasts, shows no reserves growth at all. The USGS F50 level suggests there's almost 700 billion barrels of reserves growth to be achieved. Who's right? Probably neither of them. What's a reasonable number? Well, let's see if we can move some distance towards recognizing what a reasonable number might be. First of all, this term reserves growth. The implication is that if you look at reserves from a field 1 year and look a few years later, that the reserves for that field should somehow have got larger with time. And let's look at some actual numbers. This rather messy looking graph takes a succession of reserves estimates for fields in the UK continental shelf, or what people would normally call the UK North Sea. And it shows how, now these are internal numbers, these are not SEC compatible numbers or anything else. These are numbers extracted semi-legally from a major oil company. Anything you extract from a major oil company is at best semi-legal, but this shows for, I suppose, about a dozen fields, maybe a little bit more. You can see the colors. It shows how internal reserve estimates varied from the time that development was sanctioned. I think sanction is a term that most people understand. This is the point where the company made the decision to go ahead and develop the field. So a certain reserves number was associated with their understanding of the field at sanction time. And then as the field was drilled up and wells were tested and eventually put on production, new estimates of reserves were made. And you can see that in some fields, after the field had been on production for about 7 years, you can see that reserves were had increased by nearly 250% from the original estimate. I mean, that must have been a pretty tight, unpleasant, unattractive field in many ways. But anyway, these are actual numbers. Quite a few fields where reserves had gone up they'd gone up for 100% is the sort of no change level. They'd gone up from 100 to 150 or so, so significant increases in reserves. But what I would like you to look at is the fact there are probably at least as many fields, if not more, where there have been either small or quite significant reductions in reserves with time. So reserves don't always grow. Now, the numbers you see for US fields where reserves have been calculated compatible with US Securities Exchange Commission rules, they do grow, but they grow for a totally different reason. These are numbers, these are technical estimates from within one oil company, and they're not SEC compatible, but they're the best estimates that technical people could make, and they don't increase with time necessarily. Last year, hopefully everybody who's here now was here last year, I talked about reserves and how they were calculated, and I said that we calculate our reserves by taking a resource, which is the oil in place or the gas in place. The resource is something that is relatively easy to calculate. and we multiply the resource number by a recovery factor. Now, recovery factors are very difficult to calculate, or they're very difficult to calculate with any great confidence. Anyone can calculate them, I mean, it's just arithmetic, but calculating them in a way which is defensible and which is realistic is difficult. Recovery factors for different types of oil fields can be as low as 5% or as high as 70%, so there's a huge range of recovery factors. And the way in which you might calculate these recovery factors within an individual company, or perhaps within an individual country, there'll be a standard way of doing it. But the standards differ sharply from company to company and from country to country. And sometimes people keep these procedures and standards confidential, so there's no way of knowing exactly how they're being calculated. So let's think a little bit about why resource estimates and why recovery factor estimates might change. When you start drilling up a structure and you've only one or two wells, there's considerable uncertainty in your resource estimates. You may have estimated the rock volume incorrectly, you may not understand the oil saturation, the fluid properties. So early in the life of a field, there's certainly an uncertainty associated with your resource size, which could be as much as plus or minus 20%. Why might these resource estimates change as we either revise our existing data or collect more data? Well, revisions are as likely to cause a decrease as an increase. If we've made realistic estimates in the beginning, there's no particular reason why when we change these estimates they should get bigger rather than smaller, or vice versa. So revisions to our existing reservoir data are neutral in terms of changing our resource estimate. But as we get additional reservoir data, as we drill more wells, as we drill infill wells, drill wells around the edges of our structure, then if we're following the US SEC reserve calculation procedures, then we will get an increase, because as we add more wells, we add to the parts of the field where we can claim reserves. But US SEC reserve rules are only used essentially by the major oil companies. They're not used by OPEC. They're not used by most national oil companies. So since the US SEC rules are probably only used now for about 23% or less of world production, it's only in those fields that this SEC-related rise in reserves will occur. In all other fields around the world, new data, as we collect it, is just as likely to result in our resources shrinking as it is to help them increase. When we look at recovery factor estimates, now you remember that our reserves is the resource times the recovery factor, why might our recovery factor estimates change? Well, if oil prices change, this may change our recovery factor. If we get higher oil prices, we can do two things. First of all, we can use existing technology more densely, more effectively, so we can drill infill wells, we can complete our wells as intelligent wells, we can do 4D size, and we can do lots of things that we were doing before, but we can do more of it. So that might change our recovery factor. We can investigate new technology and hopefully apply that. But we need to remember that as oil prices increase, there may be a counteracting effect. It may be that operating prices will also increase, so this may shorten our field life and hence drive recovery factors down. So higher oil prices, while in general they'll tend to increase recovery factors, they won't do it always. Why else might recovery factor estimates change? Technical advances, this is the one that everyone thinks of. New technology is going to save us was the phrase I think that people had a few years ago. There are all sorts of things certainly that new technology can help us with. Better housekeeping. If we could cut water production, which is estimated to cost something like $15 billion a year in the US, if we could cut out water production, that would have a dramatic effect on production economics and on field life and hence on recovery factor. If we could stop flaring and venting gas, that again would have a big effect on recovery factors. Something like 25% of US demand for natural gas is flared or vented worldwide. I mean, it's just an incredible number. We could improve current technologies. We could come up with ways of making our water flooding, our gas flooding more effective. We could do some work perhaps on tertiary recovery, miscible gas flooding, CO2 flooding. Okay, it's only contributing something like 1.5 million barrels a day worldwide now, but perhaps we could double that over 10 or 15 years. So recovery factor estimates with new technology certainly can increase. And then there are all sorts of new things that may help us in the short to medium term. Chemical flooding, thermal methods, microbial methods. People have been talking about microbial stuff for as long as I've been in the oil industry. Maybe it'll actually happen. Maybe we're getting closer to the time when some of these really new techniques will change recovery factor estimates. A couple of quick comments about CO2. People have been talking about CO2 injection as the answer to everything. There are two reasons for injecting CO2 into the ground generally. One is to get rid of it, which is generally called sequestration, getting it somewhere in the ground where it's not doing any harm anymore. And then there's the other idea, which is to put it in the ground, but in an oil field where it may increase recovery under the right conditions. Now, when we talk about CO2 and EOR, we need to bear in mind the huge gap between world CO2 production and world CO2 injection. We're producing something close to 30 billion tons a year of CO2. We're currently injecting about 30 million tons. So this sort of concept that getting rid of CO2 was going to, of the world surplus CO2 was going to be achieved by injecting it into the ground is probably rather premature. CO2 as an EOR process, CO2 injection as an EOR process it's a clever one. It mobilizes oil that's been left immobile by earlier recovery processes. So its main application is in fields where there's been primary and secondary recovery, but it hasn't been very efficient, a lot of immobile oil there. And under the right pressure and temperature conditions, if we have easy access to CO2, then it can improve recovery, but only in a very limited range of fields is it likely to be effective. As far as sequestration is concerned, I think the oil industry, the hydrocarbon industry is in a great place to do good things with CO2, but because it has all the skills and knowledge which are required to deal with it properly. But going back to reserves growth, where are the places where there is scope for reserves growth to have a real effect on supply? Now, when I wrote this paper, I had read Chris Grabowski and Phil Hart's May 2007 paper. I didn't read it again until after I'd written this presentation, and I didn't realize how much of Chris's paper had stuck in my mind, because several of the things I'm going to say over the next 6.5 minutes are taken from or relate closely to what Chris has said. But we can identify, just moving quickly through these slides, we can identify the types of fields where reserve growth techniques have application. And essentially, they're going to be in fields where we have easy access and where development hasn't proceeded too far. If you have big fields offshore working from complex production platforms, and the platforms are well developed and the field is well down into its field life, there's little possibility of being able to install new facilities to do the things which are likely to be required for reserves growth to be effective. So there's only a small subset of fields, really, where we can expect to see significant changes in reserves growth. In fields which are undeveloped, which are under development or in yet to find fields, it's probable that when estimates of reserves are made, that these estimates have been made taking into account new technology. So there isn't a lot of scope for significantly increasing the reserves of these sort of fields. These changes which new technology can bring about are already included in the reserves estimates that we have. People are sometimes puzzled by the fact that recovery efficiency is is so low. I said it's within the range of sometimes as low as 5%, sometimes as much as 70%, in general probably in the 30s and low 40s. There are three components when we calculate recovery efficiency from a water flood, for instance, which is the most common form of secondary recovery. There are three components to calculating our recovery efficiency, and these involve looking at how effectively the water is spreading aerially through the field, vertically through the field, and how effectively it's actually going through the pore space in the field. And although aerially and vertically we can get pretty high displacement efficiencies, recovery efficiencies, we can probably get to 100% aerially. We can't get to 100% vertically. You can never get your water-oil contact to come right up to the top of your reservoir, but it can go perhaps 80%, 90% of the way. The pore displacement is the one that causes the efficiency to be most hurt. The pore displacement efficiency is given in the equation on this slide, and it's determined basically by how low we can get our final oil saturation, because the efficiency is defined by the ratio of final oil saturation to initial oil saturation. Now, we can never get our final oil saturation down to zero. There's always some oil which is stuck in the pore system. In a water-wet rock, the oil, well, in either kind of wettability rock, the oil, some of it will be in very, very remote, tight parts of the pore system and isn't displaced. So our final oil saturation is the key to displacement efficiency. If we look at, this is a figure very similar to the one that Chris and Phil Hart had in their paper, but it's perhaps a little bit more pessimistic. If we look at a range of different types of field, from ones which are not yet found, through ones which have been developed at various stages in their lives, and down to suspended or abandoned fields, we can come up with a range of possible increases in recovery efficiency. And associating those with the original reserves estimates, come up with a number which gives the potential for reserves growth for fields worldwide. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second this number is necessarily right, but I think it's a lot closer to being right than either Colin Campbell's 0 or the USGS's nearly 700. So it's substantial, close to 200 billion stock tank barrels, but it's only substantial until you start thinking about our annual production rate of roughly 30 billion barrels a year. So it's something like 6 years production. The problem is, of course, it doesn't all come at once. This oil, this reserves growth, generally we're going to see the associated production turn up late in field life, well after the sort of period that Chris Grabowski was talking about when he talked about a peak coming within the next 5-6 years. This oil from reserves growth is not going to affect the peak, and probably isn't going to affect supply in the following 3 or 4 years either. It seems that new technology doesn't really have the impact on reserves growth that we would hope. New technology generally seems to go into overcoming problems in reservoirs which we didn't anticipate when we drilled them up, first of all. I've listed some types of problem here that our new technology is needed to overcome, because when we developed our fields initially, we just didn't see these problems as being significant. So our new technology is needed for us to be able to deliver on the initial estimates of reserves, not to create new ones. Now, new technology will indeed make our new developments more effective. There's no doubt at all about that. If we look at all the new types of technology which the industry uses in 2007 and compare those with the ones that were around in, say, 1987, there are loads and loads of new technologies which are enabling us to produce fields more effectively. and to suspended the original reserves. This oil from significant. So the initial estimates of reserves will indeed make the original reserves